A father who sold his son's future for 30 pieces of silver. A wife who discovered hell in her own kitchen drawer. And a single phone call that would expose the most devastating family betrayal in American naval history. What you're about to hear isn't just a spy story. It's the anatomy of how greed can turn blood into poison. May 20th, 1985. 3:30 a.m. A phone rings in a cheap Maryland motel room. "Sir, there's been an accident with your vehicle. Could you come downstairs?" John Anthony Walker Jr. rubbed his eyes, grabbed his jacket, and stepped into the elevator. He had no idea that in exactly 90 seconds, his 18-year empire of treason would end with FBI agent Bob Hunter's gun pointed directly at his chest. But to understand how America's most trusted sailor became its greatest traitor, we need to go back 18 years, to a winter night in 1967, when a desperate man made a choice that would eventually drag his own son into a federal prison cell. John Walker wasn't born a traitor. He was born into poverty, raised by an alcoholic father and a mother who could barely keep the lights on in their cramped Pennsylvania home. The Navy seemed like salvation. A clean uniform, 3 meals a day, and a chance to become someone who mattered. By 1967, at 30 years old, Walker had climbed to a position most enlisted men only dream about: Chief Warrant Officer at the Atlantic Submarine Force Communications Center in Norfolk, Virginia. He held the keys to America's most sensitive secrets: cryptographic materials that protected every message sent between U.S. submarines and command. These weren't just passwords. These were the mathematical keys that unlocked the entire naval communication system. In the wrong hands, they could reveal submarine patrol routes, missile launch protocols, and defense plans. But John Walker had a problem that no amount of patriotism could solve: debt. He'd tried to live the American dream, bought a house in a nice neighborhood, opened a bar. He had bought a new car. But poor business decisions and a growing alcohol problem had turned the dream into a nightmare. By late 1967, creditors were calling daily. His wife Barbara was drinking more. The children could feel the tension crackling through the house like static electricity. And John Walker was drowning. That's when the idea first whispered in his mind. So quietly at first that he could pretend he wasn't really considering it. What if? One evening in December 1967, Walker stayed late at the communications center. His hands moved almost automatically, sliding a classified cryptographic key list into his briefcase. His heart pounded so hard, he was certain the guard at the exit could hear it. But the guard just nodded, smiled, wished him a good evening. Walker sat in his car in the parking lot for 20 minutes, the briefcase burning like a hot coal in the passenger seat. He could still turn around. He could still slide that key list back into the vault tomorrow morning and pretend this moment of weakness never happened. Instead, he started the engine and drove north toward Washington, D.C. Have you ever stood at a crossroads where you knew, absolutely knew, that your next step would change everything? Where turning back was still possible, but moving forward meant crossing a line you could never uncross. That's where John Walker stood that cold December night, cigarette smoke curling up in his car as he parked across the street from the Soviet embassy. The building looked surprisingly ordinary. Just another administrative structure with lights glowing in a few windows. Walker sat there for almost an hour, watching. Twice he reached for the ignition to leave. Twice he pulled his hand back. Just go inside. Talk to them. See what they say. You don't have to actually do anything. The lies we tell ourselves in moments of betrayal are always the most convincing. Walker stubbed out his cigarette, grabbed the briefcase, and walked across the street. Each step felt like wading through deep water. His finger hovered over the embassy buzzer for a long moment, and then he pressed it. The door opened. A young man in a suit looked at him with carefully neutral eyes. "I'm a U.S. Navy officer," Walker said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I have information I think your government would be interested in." The young man's expression didn't change. "Please, come inside." What happened in the next 2 hours would set in motion the longest-running and most damaging spy ring in U.S. naval history. Walker opened his briefcase and showed them the cryptographic key list, a document so sensitive that its compromise could allow the Soviets to read virtually every encrypted naval message. The KGB officer across the desk maintained professional calm, but Walker could see the flash of hunger in his eyes. "How much?" Walker asked. The negotiation was surprisingly businesslike. Several $1,000s for the key list. A regular weekly salary of $500 to $1,000 for continued access. Dead drop locations would be established. Communication protocols set up. Everything professional, everything civilized, everything utterly treasonous. Walker walked out of that embassy with more cash in his pocket than he'd seen in years. But what he'd really walked out with was a chain. One that would eventually wrap around his wife, his brother, his son, and his best friend, dragging them all down into the same darkness. But he didn't know that yet. That December night, driving back to Norfolk with money in his pocket and damnation in his soul, John Walker actually felt relief. He'd solved his financial problems. Nobody would ever know. It would just be this once, maybe twice, just until he got back on his feet. The lies we tell ourselves are always the most dangerous. Barbara Walker had learned to live with fear. Fear of John's temper when he drank. Fear of the bills piling up on the kitchen table. Fear of what the neighbors thought when they heard shouting through the walls. But the fear she felt on that spring evening in 1968 was different. It was the kind that turns your blood to ice water. She'd been looking for the checkbook. Nothing suspicious, just normal household finances. But the drawer that was supposed to contain bills and receipts instead revealed neat stacks of $100 bills, more money than John should have had from any legitimate source. Underneath the cash were papers. Strange papers with technical diagrams and Soviet writing in the margins. If you've ever discovered something that made you wish you could unknow it, made you wish you'd never opened that drawer or read that message or asked that question, then you understand the exact moment when Barbara Walker's world shattered. Her hands trembled as she spread the papers across the kitchen table. She didn't fully understand what she was looking at, but she understood enough. Her husband, the father of her 4 children, the man she'd built a life with, was doing something terribly, terribly wrong. She heard his car pull into the driveway. Panic seized her. She shoved the papers back into the drawer, tried to arrange the cash the way it had been, rushed to the sink to appear busy. But her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the dish she was pretending to wash. John walked in and knew immediately. Maybe it was the way she stood too rigidly. Maybe it was the tear tracks on her face she'd forgotten to wipe away. Maybe it was just the instinct of a man who'd been living a double life for months. "What did you do, Barbara?" His voice was quiet, dangerous. "I was just looking for the checkbook. I didn't mean to." "What did you see?" The conversation that followed would haunt Barbara Walker for the rest of her life. John didn't deny anything. Instead, he explained in cold, matter-of-fact terms exactly what he was doing. He was working for the Soviets. He was providing classified information. It was perfectly safe. Nobody would ever find out. And the money? God, Barbara, look at all this money. They could finally live the life they deserved. Barbara's response was immediate. "We have to go to the police." John's face transformed into something she barely recognized. He stepped closer, and she instinctively moved back until she hit the kitchen counter. "If you go to the police," he said, each word deliberate, "they'll arrest me. I'll go to prison, probably for life. What happens to our children then? You think you can raise 4 kids on your own? You think anyone will hire the wife of a convicted traitor?" He moved even closer. "And Barbara, if you turn me in, I'll make sure you go down with me. I'll tell them you knew from the beginning, that you helped, that you spent the money too. You'll lose the children. They'll end up in foster care, split up, destroyed." It was the perfect trap. Barbara was already struggling with alcoholism, already financially dependent, already terrified of losing her children. John had found her pressure points with surgical precision. She made a choice that night, a choice that would eat at her soul for the next 16 years. She would stay silent. She would pretend she didn't know. She would protect her children the only way she thought possible, by protecting their father's terrible secret. But secrets like that don't stay contained. They spread like poison through a family, contaminating everything they touch. In 1969, Walker received new orders. Instructor at the Naval Communications School in San Diego. For most sailors, this would be a routine assignment. For John Walker, it was a hunting ground. He needed to expand his operation. The KGB had made that clear. One source was valuable, but vulnerable. If Walker got transferred to a position without access, or if he retired, the intelligence would dry up. They needed redundancy. They needed more people inside. Walker began watching his students carefully, looking for what he would later describe in court as men with larceny in their hearts. That's when he met Jerry Alfred Whitworth. Whitworth was talented, detail-oriented, and perpetually broke. Exactly the kind of man Walker specialized in corrupting. But Walker was patient. He spent years building the friendship, taking Whitworth out for beers, talking about their families, their frustrations with Navy pay, their dreams of something better. Slowly, carefully, Walker began testing Whitworth's boundaries. A joke about stealing office supplies. A comment about how classified documents were basically worthless outside the military, so who cared if they went missing? Small moral compromises, each one making the next one easier. It took until 1973 for Walker to make his actual pitch. They were in a San Diego bar, several beers in, when Walker leaned across the table. "What if I told you," Walker said quietly, "that I know a way we could make real money? Not Navy pay. Real money." Whitworth's eyes narrowed. "What kind of way?" Walker spun his carefully rehearsed lie. "I've got a contact who works with Israeli intelligence. They're desperate for certain technical information, nothing that would actually hurt America, just stuff that helps our allies. They pay incredibly well. The moment when someone you trust asks you to cross a line, that moment feels different than you'd expect. It doesn't feel dramatic. It feels almost ordinary, like a business proposition over drinks. That's how corruption works. It never announces itself as evil. It always wears the mask of opportunity." Whitworth was hesitant, but intrigued. Israel was an ally, after all. And the money Walker described, thousands of dollars for relatively simple information, it seemed too good to be true. Because it was. The truth was that Walker's Israeli contact was actually the KGB. But Whitworth wouldn't discover that lie for years, and by then he'd be in too deep to escape. Over the next 12 years, Jerry Whitworth would become the most valuable source in the entire spy ring. He had access to cryptographic key lists, technical manuals, communication plans, everything the Soviets needed to decode American naval communications. He photographed thousands of pages of classified material, passing them to Walker in carefully orchestrated meetings. The money kept coming, and with it, the rationalization. I'm helping an ally. I'm not really hurting anyone. Nobody will ever know. But someone would know. Someone was already starting to suspect. Because while Walker was busy recruiting Whitworth in California, his marriage to Barbara was finally collapsing back in Virginia. The violence was getting worse. The drinking was out of control. And Barbara was starting to realize that staying silent wasn't protecting her children, it was destroying them. In 1976, she would file for divorce. But the secret would survive the marriage. For 8 more years, Barbara would carry the weight of what she knew, watching as her ex-husband continued his betrayal, knowing that somewhere in his web of treason, their own son might soon be caught. And she would be right. Because John Walker had already decided that if he was going to build an empire of espionage, why shouldn't it be a family business? When the person who's supposed to protect you is the one leading you into darkness, where do you turn? That's the question Michael Walker would soon face when his father approached him with an offer that no son should ever hear from his father. A brother who thought $2,000 was worth betraying his country. A son who stuffed classified documents into his locker while his shipmates slept 3 feet away. And a best friend who typed anonymous confessions in the dark, then burned them the next morning. This is what happens when loyalty becomes a currency and family becomes a weapon. Michael Walker was 19 years old when his father sat him down in the private detective office they shared and made an offer that would define the rest of his life. "Son," John said, lighting a cigarette, "how would you like to make more money than any kid your age has a right to?" Michael thought his dad was talking about detective work. He had no idea he was being recruited into the most damaging spy ring in American naval history. But before John Walker could turn his son into a traitor, he needed to perfect his system, and that meant bringing in someone whose betrayal would hurt even more than family. Someone who trusted him completely. Arthur Walker had always been the responsible one. While his younger brother John was getting into trouble, Arthur was serving honorably in the Navy, rising to the rank of lieutenant commander. He'd done everything right, served his country, got an honorable discharge, started a small defense contracting business in Virginia Beach. But by the late 1970s, doing everything right had led Arthur straight into bankruptcy. His business was failing. Creditors were circling. His wife was worried sick about losing their house. And that's when his little brother John showed up with a sympathetic ear and a dangerous solution. "Art," John said over coffee one afternoon, "I know you're going through a rough patch. What if I told you I could help?" Arthur was suspicious, but desperate. "What kind of help?" John leaned back, casual. "I've got a client, does competitive intelligence for corporations. They pay top dollar for certain types of technical documents. Nothing classified, nothing important, just specifications and plans that are technically restricted, but practically worthless. The kind of stuff that sits in filing cabinets, gathering dust." It was the same lie Walker had perfected over the years. Make it sound mundane. Make it sound victimless. Make it sound like easy money for meaningless paper. Arthur hesitated. He still had his security clearance from his Navy days. And he'd landed a position at a defense contractor that gave him access to various naval documents. "I don't know, John. Even low-level stuff, if it's restricted." "Art." John's voice hardened slightly. How much do you owe right now? 30,000? 40? What happens when the bank forecloses? What happens to your family? When desperation meets opportunity, we tell ourselves stories. We tell ourselves it's just this once. We tell ourselves nobody will get hurt. We tell ourselves we don't really have a choice. Arthur Walker told himself all of these things as he agreed to photograph 2 insignificant documents for his brother. The documents were ship repair plans, technical specifications that Arthur genuinely believed were operationally worthless. He used the copy machine at his office after hours, his hands sweating despite the air conditioning, and delivered the copies to John the next day. John handed him an envelope containing $2,000 in cash. Arthur stared at the money, stunned. For those 2 documents? John, they're not worth anywhere near this much. John smiled. My client values reliability. This is a retainer. There might be more work in the future. What Arthur didn't know, what he wouldn't know until FBI agents kicked down his door years later, was that those insignificant documents had already been photographed onto microfilm and delivered to a KGB handler. That the $2,000 wasn't payment for the documents themselves, but the first link in a chain designed to bind him forever. Because that's how the KGB worked. Overpay massively for something minor, making the target feel like they've stumbled onto a gold mine. Get them comfortable with the process. Then, once they've crossed that line and accepted the money, slowly increase the requests. By the time they realize they're in too deep, there's no way out that doesn't end in prison. Arthur Walker had just sold his freedom for $2,000. If recruiting his brother was opportunistic, recruiting his son was something far darker. It was premeditated destruction disguised as paternal guidance. Michael Walker had dropped out of high school and was drifting. John, who'd won custody after the divorce from Barbara, brought Michael to work at his private detective agency in Norfolk. To the outside world, it looked like a father helping his troubled son get his life together. The truth was far more calculated. John got Michael his GD, then pushed him to re-enroll in high school. He encouraged him to get good grades. He helped him prepare for the Navy entrance exams. Every step of the way, John was grooming his son not for success, but for exploitation. The conversation happened in John's office on a Tuesday evening in 1982. Michael had just received his orders. He'd been accepted into the Navy and would be shipping out for basic training in a few weeks. John poured them both a drink. Son, I'm proud of you. You're going to do great things in the Navy. Michael beamed. After years of feeling like a screw-up, his father's approval meant everything. There's something I want to talk to you about, John continued. An opportunity. A way for you to help your country and make excellent money at the same time. Michael leaned forward, interested. John explained that he worked with government contractors who needed information about naval operations, efficiency reports, maintenance schedules, communication protocols. Nothing that would endanger anyone. Just administrative data that helped defense companies better serve the Navy. Imagine trusting someone completely. Imagine that person is your father, the one person who's supposed to protect you from the world's dangers. Now imagine them leading you directly into the fire and calling it opportunity. That's the unique cruelty of what John Walker did to his son. Michael didn't understand the full picture. He was 19, eager to please his father, and the money John described, hundreds of dollars for simple photocopies, seemed incredible. He agreed. By 1983, Michael was stationed aboard the USS Nimitz, one of America's most advanced aircraft carriers, and he was filling his locker with classified documents. The process was frighteningly simple. Michael had access to the ship's communications center as part of his duties. He would wait until the late-night watch when fewer people were around, photocopy classified message traffic and cryptographic materials, and hide them in his personal locker. During port visits, he'd stuff the documents into a gym bag and deliver them to his father. John would praise him, tell him he was doing great, slip him envelopes of cash. And Michael, desperate for his father's approval after years of feeling inadequate, kept doing it. What Michael didn't know was that his father was taking those documents, photographing them onto microfilm, and passing them to Soviet handlers. That every classified message his son stole was being read in Moscow within days. That the government contractors were KGB officers who were using Michael's information to track American carrier battle groups and plan potential attack scenarios. Michael Walker thought he was helping his father's business. He was actually helping the Soviet Union prepare for World War III. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away in California, Jerry Whitworth was falling apart. He'd been in the spy ring for over a decade now. He'd provided thousands of pages of cryptographic key lists, technical manuals, and communication plans. He'd been paid hundreds of thousands of dollars. And somewhere along the way, he'd discovered that Walker had lied. The information wasn't going to Israel. It was going to the Soviet Union, America's enemy. Whitworth tried to rationalize it. The Cold War was winding down, right? The Soviets weren't really going to attack. The information was probably just sitting in a filing cabinet somewhere in Moscow, unused. Nobody was getting hurt. But late at night, alone with his thoughts and his guilt, Whitworth knew the truth. He was a traitor. He had betrayed every sailor who trusted encrypted communications to keep them safe. He had sold out his country for money. In May 1984, Whitworth sat down at his typewriter and composed a letter to the FBI. The letter was extraordinary, a confession wrapped in a plea bargain. He admitted to providing top-secret cryptographic key lists to the Soviets for over a decade. He explained that he was part of a ring of at least 3 people. He offered to help the FBI destroy the network, but only if they granted him immunity. He signed it, Russ Somewhere, USA. Have you ever written something in a moment of clarity, knowing it's the right thing to do, but then stared at it and felt terror wash over you? That's where Whitworth was, caught between conscience and survival, between redemption and self-preservation. He mailed the letter. Then he immediately regretted it. Over the next few weeks, Whitworth sent several more letters to the FBI, each one providing more details about the spy ring's operations. He described dead-drop procedures. He outlined communication methods. He gave timeline information. The FBI took the letters seriously, but couldn't immediately identify who RUS was. They began investigating, trying to narrow down the possibilities. And Whitworth panicked. In his final letter, sent in August 1984, Whitworth wrote something that would haunt him forever. "I've changed my mind. I will not be contacting you again. Forget everything I've told you." He convinced himself that if he just stayed quiet, if he just stopped passing information to Walker, if he just faded away, nobody would ever know. The FBI letters would go nowhere. He'd retire quietly and live with his guilt in private. But guilt isn't the only thing that haunts traitors. So does timing. Because 3 months after Whitworth sent his final letter, Barbara Walker, drunk, despondent, and finally unable to carry the weight anymore, picked up the phone and called the FBI. Barbara had been divorced from John for 8 years. 8 years of watching from a distance as her ex-husband continued his treason. 8 years of drinking herself to sleep while carrying a secret that grew heavier every day. But what finally broke her wasn't conscience. It was fear. She'd heard rumors that John was involving their son Michael in his business. The thought of her child, her baby, following his father's path into treason was more than she could bear. On a November evening in 1984, Barbara sat in her apartment with a bottle of wine and a phone number she'd looked up in the directory, FBI, Boston Field Office. She was drunk, which made the call easier. She was also terrified, which made every word harder. "My ex-husband," she told the agent who answered, her words slurring slightly, "is a spy. For the Russians. He's been doing it for years. And I think our son is involved now." The agent on the other end had heard a lot of strange calls over the years. Paranoid neighbors, conspiracy theorists, vindictive ex-spouses making wild accusations. This sounded like another one. "Ma'am, these are serious allegations. Can you provide any specific evidence?" Barbara's voice cracked. "I found documents in 1968, cryptographic materials, Soviet writing, cash. He threatened me. Said he'd take the children if I told anyone. But now he's got Michael doing it too, and I can't let my son." She broke down crying. The agent made notes but remained skeptical. However, FBI protocol required that all such allegations be forwarded to the appropriate field office. The call was routed to Norfolk, Virginia, where John Walker lived. It would take weeks for the FBI to take Barbara seriously. They interviewed her multiple times, asking for details, checking her story against known facts. Her daughter Laura corroborated parts of the account, describing the documents she'd seen as a child, the strange meetings her father had, the cash that appeared and disappeared. Slowly, the pieces aligned. Barbara wasn't a bitter ex-wife making things up. She was telling the truth. By early 1985, the FBI had opened a full counterintelligence investigation into John Anthony Walker Jr. They tapped his phones. They surveilled his movements. They built a case brick by brick. And John Walker, confident after 18 years of successful espionage, had no idea that his ex-wife's phone call had just started a countdown timer on his freedom. In May 1985, FBI wiretaps picked up coded language in Walker's phone conversations that indicated an upcoming dead drop, a physical exchange of materials with his Soviet handlers. The agents monitoring the case went on high alert. This was it. After months of investigation, they would finally catch Walker in the act. On May 19th, Walker drove from Norfolk toward Washington, D.C., telling family he had business to handle. FBI surveillance teams tracked him the entire way, staying far enough back to avoid detection, but close enough to document every move. As evening fell, Walker drove into the countryside of Montgomery County, Maryland. He seemed to be following a predetermined route, making turns that suggested he was heading to a specific location. The FBI teams coordinated their positions using multiple vehicles to avoid being spotted. At approximately 7:30 p.m., Walker pulled his van to the side of a quiet rural road. He stepped out, looked around carefully, and walked to a utility pole marker. From his vehicle, he retrieved a large plastic trash bag. Inside that bag were 124 pages of classified documents stolen from the USS Nimitz by Michael Walker. There were also letters from Whitworth, outlining recent access and future opportunities. And there was Walker's own written report to his Soviet handlers, detailing the current state of the network. Walker placed the bag at the base of the utility pole and drove away. In that moment, with FBI cameras photographing his every move, John Walker still believed he was untouchable. After 18 years of successful treason, he'd convinced himself he was too smart to ever get caught. That's the final lie that traitors tell themselves, right up until the handcuffs click shut. The Soviet courier, a diplomat named Alexei Tkachenko, was supposed to retrieve the package later that evening. But Soviet intelligence had trained their people well. Tkachenko made several passes through the area and spotted the FBI surveillance. He never approached the dead drop. Walker didn't know his pickup had failed. He drove to a nearby Ramada Inn and checked in for the night, expecting a signal from his handlers the next morning confirming the exchange. Instead, at 3:30 a.m. on May 20th, his phone rang with a very different message. "Sir, there's been an accident with your vehicle. Could you come downstairs?" Walker rubbed sleep from his eyes, pulled on his pants, and grabbed his .38 caliber revolver. He always carried it, a habit from his detective work. He stepped into the elevator and rode down to the lobby. The elevator doors opened. FBI agent Bob Hunter stood there with his weapon drawn. Behind him, 4 more agents, all armed. All ready. "FBI, hands up, now!" Walker's hand moved toward his gun. For one frozen second, everyone in that lobby was a heartbeat away from gunfire. "Don't," Hunter said quietly. "You're too smart for that, John. It's over." And in that moment, John Walker's face showed something the FBI agents would remember for years. Not fear, not anger, but genuine surprise. After 18 years of treason, after recruiting his brother, his son, and his best friend, after stealing millions of dollars worth of intelligence, John Walker had actually believed he would never be caught. But what Walker didn't know, as those handcuffs closed around his wrists, was that his arrest was just the beginning. Because that same morning, FBI teams were moving on the others. And one of them, his own son, was about to face something worse than federal prison, the hatred of every sailor on his ship who had realized they'd been betrayed by one of their own.